There's been a lot of sad
that I'm working on.
Okay.
My own sense of
That's
helplessness.
my
And I was like, okay.
Welcome to another installment of Leadership Landscape TV, where we go inside the minds of local community leaders and allow them a chance to offer some keen insights into how they see themselves and, most importantly, explore just what makes them tick. I'm Kurt Jacobs, host of Leadership Landscape TV, where previous interviews have included leaders from the world of politics, religion, sports, community activism, and civic engagement. Today, our 153rd guest is Terry Taylor. He's the Executive Director of Interfaith Paths to Peace, or IPP, which is a Louisville-based interreligious nonprofit organization. For those of you who don't know our guest, allow me to read some of his bio. In 1973, Terry graduated magna cum laude in English and philosophy from the University of Indianapolis. In 1976, he received a master's degree in journalism from Ball State University. In 1993, he received a Master of Fine Arts in the Book Arts from the University of Alabama. His exploits are global. In 2006, Terry attended the commemoration ceremony marking the anniversary of the 1945 atomic bombing in Hiroshima, Japan. In 2007, he traveled to Israel and the occupied West Bank on a fact-finding peacemaking mission with a Jewish and Muslim friend. Pretty cool. In 2008, Terry was one of 6 U.S. interfaith leaders selected to be part of an interfaith delegation to Egypt and Syria as a guest of the National Peace Foundation and the Islamic Society of North America. That same year, he took part in a graduate school level study of Islam at Dar al-Islam Mosque in New Mexico. 2010, Terry and yours truly shared in the distinction of being named 2 of Leadership Louisville Center's and City's top 128 connectors from more than 19,000 nominees. That same year, he visited Iran as a member of a 10-person citizen diplomacy and participated in the Leadership Louisville Bingham Fellows program. In 2011, Louisville Center for Women and Families honored Terry as its 2011 Man of Distinction. And that same year, he was invited to take part in an interfaith conference in Morocco, along with another visit to Hiroshima in support of the Interfaith Paths to Peace exhibit. 2012, Terry received a Service Recognition Award from APPKI, a Louisville-based Pakistani philanthropic group. In 2013, he was a 3-day Louisville visit to the Dalai Lama. He handled that as well. You're a busy guy. He also visited Belfast, North Ireland, learned how the Irish handled the Troubles, and a 2-week spiritual pilgrimage to the ashrams in India. His collaborative projects include working with the Catholic Archdiocese of Louisville, the Council of the Jewish Federation of Louisville, Episcopal Diocese of Louisville, Kentucky, and he also has dealt with the Tibetan Buddhist community, 10,000 Buddhist Summit Monastery of Corydon, Indiana, the Hindu Temple of Kentucky, and Kentucky and American Indiana Advocates. Terry, wow, you are a busy guy. It's a pleasure to have you on Leadership Landscape TV. I'm going to take a drink of water. You can take it from here.
It's great to be with you, Kurt. And it actually was just exhausting to listen to you talk about all that. I'm surprised I did all that over the last
What I
years.
should have said is you visited how many countries in so many years and be done with it, right?
You know, actually, I visited 32 countries in all 50 states. And interestingly, mostly when I tell people that story, they're most interested in the fact that I visited all 50 states rather than how many countries.
What drives you to do what you do? I think it's a very unique leadership position that you're in.
Well, I grew up as a kind of poor kid in a disadvantaged environment, and I think all my life I've had a drive to excel.
Mm-hmm.
And that really, whatever I'm doing, I want to be the best at.
Sure.
But also, I've kind of come to think that I have some skill in bringing people of different religions and different faiths together to understand each other better. And being able to do that, I think, just brings peace to our community, the nation, and the world. And it's been fun to be able to see some of that happen and to see situations that were maybe difficult and potentially violent be calmed down. And so that's kind of what drives me.
Whom do you credit most influential in your life, Terry? It can be more than one, personal or professional.
Sure. In terms of the influences in my life, it's not necessarily a person, but I always look back to 3 books that I read in the 1970s when I was in my 20s. One is a book on architecture by a man named Robert Venturi that's called Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which is really not about architecture. It's about aesthetics, about a way of looking at beauty in the world. Another one is a book of photography by a man named Richard Avedon. It's called Portraits, and it just gave me a completely different way of looking at the world. And the third is a novel by a Colombian writer named Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He just died about a year ago.
Wow.
Had won the Nobel Prize for Literature and was the key figure in a movement in writing called magic realism that kind of combined the American realism that you would find in the writing of Hemingway or Mark Twain with a kind of magical way of looking at the world. And it just, again, gave me a completely different way of thinking about writing and communication, something I'd never really thought about. So those are probably the three influences that I credit most for how my life has progressed.
It's a very unique answer because it's usually family or an individual. It's books. I find that very intriguing.
Yeah.
From a leader. That's very interesting. What was the most defining moment of your life? And it can be more than one, personal or professional.
Well, and actually, thinking about that, I'm glad you asked that question. When I was young, I'd had sort of a troubled youth, and I should point out, too, that today I serve on the board of the local chapter of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And when I was about 15 years old, I'd gone through a lot of very, very difficult things and made a kind of half-hearted attempt at suicide.
Wow.
I don't think I really wanted to kill myself. It was more a call for attention. But I was really at kind of the bottom of my life. But it was at that point that I just made the conscious decision to kind of pull myself up by my bootstraps and to try to excel. And it was from that moment in probably 1966 that my life kind of turned around and I succeeded in school. I was probably a smart, poor kid.
Okay.
And so I was able to earn a scholarship to college, and people have been very generous and helpful to me all throughout my life. But just that idea that you don't have to just endure troubles in your life, you can make yourself something. And I hear that story from a lot of people.
What is your biggest professional triumph, Terry? It can be more than one, personal as well.
Well, probably the biggest triumph for me is just being able to succeed in a number of different areas. I'm not limited. And so I've been an interfaith leader for more than a decade. In my adult life, I worked in higher education, doing public relations and publications work. But I'm also a writer. I've published a nonfiction book. I'm an artist and photographer and have gotten recognition in each of those areas. So I think for me, the idea that I wasn't limited or down, one narrow channel, but that I could communicate and succeed in a number of different areas is really probably what's most important to me when I look back at my life. And I'm about to retire, so it's my life's going to shift into another mode.
Yes. And what is your biggest professional regret? Again, it could be more than one, personal, professional. Regret's a strong word for some of our guests. Disappointment, maybe?
Well, actually, I don't even know if it's a regret, but I remember at some point in my mid-career, I was talking with a friend who would ask me what I call annoying cocktail party questions.
Oh, yeah.
And we were sitting around one day, and he said to me, if you could be anything other than what you are right now, what would you be? And at that time, I was a photographer, and I was doing public relations work, and I hadn't even thought about it, and I said, an architect. And I don't know, that just was somehow in the back of my mind. So it's not exactly a regret, but if I could go back and do something different, I think I would move into that direction and to make my creative vision substantial and something that people would actually live in or work in.
That's great. Now, the show's called Leadership Landscape TV for a reason. Can you define leadership in one word in the great English lexicon? Since you are an author, I'll give you more than one word.
One.
One?
Character.
I don't think of all the 150 plus guests we've had, no, I don't think anyone has ever said character.
Yeah, and you shared some of the questions with me ahead of time,
Sure.
and it was one I'd really not thought about, but the more I look at things and the more I see what's happening in the world and people who are in leadership positions, the people who seem to me to be most successful are people who are not necessarily following a plan. I know a lot of people write books of like the 10 ways to succeed or how you do this, and here's a cookbook recipe for how to do things. But it's more when people internalize their values, live out their values, act from a place deep in their own lives, that people really learn to see them and trust them with what they do. And that's really how I define character. I was chatting with one of your staff people before we went on air today, and we were talking about that idea of living out your values. And with what we do in my own organization, Interfaith Past Peace in the office, we all have little tips and things like everybody does. But I think more than anything, we try to live out values of tolerance and kindness and sharing and compassion to each other.
If you could change one thing in your life or in general, what would that be, Terry? It's really a self-interpretive question. It can be global, political, personal.
That's a really good question. And thinking about if I could just change one thing in the world, encounter different religions all the time, and
You
there's
travel
a lot.
quite a bit, too.
Yeah, I have traveled here and there around the world, but as I've seen things and explored things, probably the thing that has struck me most is a concept that comes out of Buddhism, and it's related to the idea of compassion. And it's an interesting distinction. In Western religion, in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, the big issue or big conflict is good and evil.
Okay.
In Eastern religions, and especially within Buddhism, the concern is not so much about a battle between good and evil and are you going to heaven or hell. It's about suffering and how
Okay.
we reduce the idea of suffering for ourselves and for other people and even for other beings, for animals, for example. And so if I could change one thing about the world, it would be to eliminate suffering or reduce the amount of suffering in the world. And I guess part of my work is about that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, can you describe in particular detail a certain incident where you utilized your own philosophy on leadership back to character? Usually I tie
Yeah,
it back to that question.
Yeah, and actually I can, and it relates to a trip that I made to Turkey a few years ago. And I was part of a delegation of about 12 people, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and we were having dinner one night. We were way out in the country, and Turkey is an Islamic country and very, very traditional, and just as in rural areas in our own country, people tend to be very conservative about the way they deal with things socially. We'd had a wonderful dinner, and dinner was over, and we were about to have a conversation, and as words were beginning, I noticed that looking around the table, aside from our delegation, which was both male and female, all the people who were going to be part of the conversation were sitting at the table, and they were all men. There were women present, but they were standing around the outside, and it was pretty
Wow.
clear they were not going to be part of the conversation. And I've learned in the work that I do that if you start demanding things or confronting people, you may not get where you want to be. But if you're respectful and courteous and kind in the way that you do things, you may actually get to where you need to be. And so in this situation, I could have pounded my fist on the table and said, hey, why aren't the women part of this conversation? You know,
exactly.
we're Americans and we're
Right.
egalitarian about men and women. But instead of that, I took a napkin and I very quietly wrote a note to the leader of our American tour group, and it said, is there a way that we can respectfully request that the sisters can be part of our conversation?
Gotcha.
And I slid it across the table quietly to the director of our American group, and I thought he was going to look at it and go, we'll talk about this later.
Yeah.
But instead of that, he passed the note to our dinner host from this community who
Oh,
was
wow.
already talking, and as he got this note, he looked at it and continued to talk, and then stopped and turned it over and looked around and said, sisters, would you like to join us for the
Well, they-
conversation?
Ah.
And of course they did, and
Of
they
course.
sat down at the table, and we had a wonderful conversation.
And they engaged, they
They
participated.
engaged, exactly.
They didn't feel
But again, in doing the kind of work that I do, I say a lot of it is really more like diplomacy than
Mm-hmm.
anything. And in this situation, you know, Americans tend to be pretty confrontive
Right.
about things. If I'd done that, I don't know if we'd gotten
No, I
anywhere.
don't
But in
think you
that
would've.
case, we made a lot of friends that evening.
If someone asked you, what does Terry Taylor stand for, what would you tell them? Not what they may think about you, which may not be suitable for TV, as I always say.
Yeah.
But-
Yeah, I don't know what people would say about me, but when I think about that and what do I stand for, more often than not, and it probably relates to the story I was just telling, I'm about both and rather than either or.
Okay.
When I find myself in a situation where there's a conflict that's bubbling up or somebody's being forced to make a decision that they don't want or don't like, and actually I had a situation like this. I was at a board meeting, not for my own organization, another board I sit on, just the other night, and something like this came up where a change was being made in the way we do things, and someone was very, very unhappy. And then again, I just sort of wrote a little note and
Nice.
slid it over to the chair of our board saying, could we find a way to do what we're required to do, but also what's being lost so that
Right.
nobody is being deprived of something, that there's not a loss. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that, but that's really it. It's trying to find a way that everybody is heard, that everybody's considered. And I don't know how you are in your own life, but more often than not, if my needs or wants are ignored, I get pretty unhappy, and I can get confrontive when I need to be.
Sure.
But I find more often than
Yeah, I
not,
can
that-
too.
yeah, that even if I'm not getting what it is I want, that if somebody acknowledges my need, my concerns, my values, I feel heard, and I'm willing to go along with what happens. So that business of being about both and rather than either or has
Okay.
worked very well for me.
Now, this is a simple question, which I think might have a very lengthy answer, knowing your
Uh-oh.
temperament. Do you think there's a difference in today's religious leaders than in past generations? And that's going to lead into some of the other questions that you've actually asked me to ask you, so I think it's a good time to do that.
Well, there probably is a difference, and I think it's a difference that is a result of what our nation is like today.
Okay.
And here's a distinction that I make. People talk about America being a melting pot.
Mhm.
I don't think we're a melting pot. A melting pot means things are melted down and just become one kind of glob of things. I think America is much more like a stew
Ah,
in which
okay.
different foods are put in, a potato, a carrot, a piece of
Yeah.
meat. You heat it up, and the flavors are shared among different
a
items
great
in that, and you
analogy.
come out with something that's appetizing, wonderful, nourishing. Each thing is still its own item,
Yeah, the
but
potato,
you've
the carrot.
shared something of all of that.
Okay.
And I like to say that I think that the walls that used to separate religions are not crumbling, but they're
Mhm.
becoming porous, and some of the beliefs and practices are starting to flow back and forth. And so something that I think is different about today than when I was growing up in the 1960s, when I can remember, I think I probably had a friend who was Jewish, didn't know what that meant. I
Right.
was Protestant and had friends who were Catholic, but there was really very little interaction. Today, you're almost forced to know something about somebody in another religion just
Mhm.
because we're becoming such a multicultural country and
Mhm.
also community. You've had many leaders on, and you probably
Sure.
know that there are over 100 different languages spoken in our public schools right here in Louisville today.
Wow.
It's
No, I
just
didn't know it was
amazing.
that many.
And so I find when we bring religious leaders together, they start talking about what they have in common, and they seem to know more than a little bit about each other's religions. You just have to
Mhm.
know those things. It's like if you're a business leader, whether you're doing television work and selling
Right.
advertising or selling furniture, you need to be aware of who your customer is and where they're coming from. And I'm
Sure.
finding this, and one of the most remarkable things to me is we were having a press conference a few years ago about the Hunger Walk, and Archbishop Kurtz was there, and one of our Buddhist monks was there, and we were getting ready to do the press conference, and I noticed that Archbishop Kurtz was standing talking to this monk and handing him his card and saying, you know, we really need to get together. Let's have coffee and talk.
Right.
So that would
Wow.
have never happened 40 years ago or
No.
50 years ago.
No. Now, you had a couple of questions. I'm going to spring them out here on the audience. Being spiritual versus religious. Can you enlighten the audience on that?
Yeah, and that's pretty interesting. And I hear a lot today from people when I talk to them that they'll say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual.
Right.
And I think where this is coming from is a notion, it's not necessarily true, but people have that perception that religion is more about rules and setting boundaries.
Okay.
You know, I'm Christian, and in order to be Christian, you have to be this way. Spirituality is much more open-ended, and people can say, you know, I have these values, I believe these things, and you can have a spirituality of one, but you can't have a religion of one.
Right.
A religion requires at least a couple of people. And so you're going to find that maybe the fastest growing group of people, I know you're a Christian television program, but you find these days that the fastest growing part of the population in terms of religion today is a group called the nuns. And it doesn't mean women who wear
Right.
black dresses
Right.
and white habits and all
Exactly.
of that. It actually means people who have no religious affiliation. And you know, at some level, we're going to have to acknowledge that. But also it means that people are beginning to pick up values from different religions.
Sure.
And I was saying to one of your staff people too that I believe that even if you're the most Bible-believing Christian or Jew, that you can still learn things from other religions that will make your own faith practice right. So we're not about converting people from one religion to another. We're just about helping people enrich their own spiritual experience.
Now, you had talked about your impending retirement, so that'll be coming up, and this show will air for many years, hopefully. If you were granted 2 weeks right today, which you're kind of going to get anyway, 14 days, 10 business days, where would you go? Who would you take with you? What would you do? There's no wrong answer.
Well, in this one, it might seem like I'm going to give some kind of enlightened answer that's related to spirituality or religion, but it's actually I'd like to go to Tahiti. And I've
Wow,
seen
imagine
pictures
that.
of like staying in a hut that's out over the water, get out of your bed, walk to the doorway, and literally dive into the crystal clear ocean, stay there for a couple of weeks, and I would take my wonderful partner, Mary, with me,
That's great.
and
That's
just
awesome.
relax and enjoy myself.
Now, this question, and I've rarely had guests offer me questions to present, so I'm just going to read it. What I have learned about the purpose of spiritual study. You want to take it from there?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I was out at a conference in Colorado, and there were a lot of religious leaders there, and I heard 3 different people speak, and they brought me to a conclusion that I should have known after doing this work for years and had never really considered. I'd always thought that all the things that you learn about religion or spirituality are supposed to make your life perfect. So if you're Billy Graham or Bob Russell from Southeast
Right.
Christian or the Dalai Lama or the Pope, you do all of these things, and there are no troubles in your world. Your family is fine. Your kids go to the right colleges. They never give you heartaches. But I realized at this conference, I heard 3 different people speak. One of them was a leader who's very, very well thought of and offers great insights to people, who said that his father was dying and it was forcing him to come face to face with his mother, with whom he hadn't spoken in 25
wow.
years.
Mm.
Another guy who's probably in his early 70s now, moving into retirement and the golden years, was thinking he was going to live out his life with his wonderful wife of many years, and who came to him one day and said, "Jack, I can't do this, I'm leaving, goodbye."
Oh, wow, nice.
And then there's a woman writer in spirituality named Anne Lamott, who is a recovering everything. She's had every problem in the world, every kind of 12-step problem, but she's found a way to cope. And what I've realized is all those things we hear in church,
Mm-hmm.
all of those things that we may hear in a synagogue, all those things that we read, are not about making your life perfect. They're about giving you the skills and tools that you need to survive when disastrous things happen in your life.
I like this question. If you could have dinner with anyone, one person, alive or dead, who would it be and why? I think it's very telling about your character. Back to that.
Well, and actually, it goes back to a question that you asked me at the beginning of the interview with the 3 books that I mentioned.
Mhm.
If I could have a dinner party, I would sit with those 3 people.
Oh, wow. that's
2
cool.
of the 3 are now dead, but I would be asking Robert Venturi about how he came to the conclusions that he had about beauty, that beauty is really not about being symmetrical, it's about being slightly asymmetrical. And our lives are like that. They're not perfect, they're slightly lopsided, but there's a beauty in that. Or Richard Avedon, who took photographs that helped us see the depth within people. They're not posed, they're actually kind of stark and very plain, but you look into the eyes of people and see the heartbreak and the triumph that's within them. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who just turned the world upside down by writing stories in which people levitate and all kinds of other unusual things
Yes.
happen, but in a realistic context. So I always tell people, and maybe of the 3 of those, it would be Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who I would most like to have dinner with.
Okay.
And I tell people, I'm a writer, but if I could write as well as he does, I would quit and do something else.
Well, there you
It's
go.
like being Babe Ruth in baseball.
Okay.
If you're that good, try something else and see if you can
Okay.
succeed.
We're going to start running short on time, so I want you to hold these up to the camera and explain to the audience what those are.
This is a little disc that has symbols for the world's great religions around it and the peace sign on the inside. This is what it's really all about, learning to live together and not just tolerate each other, but learn from each other and live together in respect. And the other thing is we work with some of our community leaders. There's a real upswing in the number of murders and the amount of violence in our city
Yeah.
this year. We're trying to understand that. But everything that we can do to help bring peace to people is what's really important. And it's not just about stopping wars around the world. It's everything from preventing suicide in our communities to addressing problems like domestic violence to violence in our streets. Peacemaking addresses every level of our lives.
Wow, that's really simple but profound.
Thank you.
Now, I'm not going to do the shameless plug. This is your book. If you want to hold it up
Yeah,
for...
this is a book that I wrote that was
That's great.
published in 2009 by Skylight Paz Publishing. It's called A Spirituality for Brokenness, and it dips into the world's religions and pulls out tools that people can use to help themselves mend when they feel like their lives have been shattered for some reason. And what's really interesting about this is when I was 50, I was going through some troubles, and I felt shattered, and I started talking to people about that, and just about everybody I talked to said, you know, I feel broken too. And so this is just something that people, I hope, can use in a way that will not make their lives perfect, but, you know, give you some tools, as I was saying before, about some ways that will help you get along when difficult things happen. And I've inscribed this for you, and it's
Thank
my
you.
gift to you, Kurt.
Thank
And
you. And you want to talk about serendipity, I have someone close to me that's going through some brokenness, so I'm going to let them take it first and read it. I think it's very timely. Also, you've got some pictures. We're going to do a quick picture association. You just kind of look at them, hold them up to the
Okay.
camera, explain what they are.
This is a picture that I took in October of 2013. I was in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and our viewers may know that Irish Catholics and Protestants for decades were killing each other over things that I don't even understand. And I was at a walk that was being done in commemoration of a terrible bombing there that killed about 30 people in a Protestant pub. But what I looked at in this was this commemoration that was happening. There were the readings of the victims, there were songs, there were prayers, but it was all looking backward. There was nothing about, we've got to find a way to live with the Catholics and get along so that this doesn't happen to our children or their
Right.
children. And I brought that back here and talked to some of our own community leaders. And again, the idea is if you're only embracing your pain, you need to do that, but if you're only embracing it, you're never going to get to a place where there's real peacemaking. Also, we have a project that we call Peace Postcards, in which we invite children of all
Nice.
ages, including me, and I'm 64, to draw or paint how they see peace. And we've
Okay.
collected cards from over 18,000 kids in over 30 countries around the world. And we do displays of those, and we've done them in Hiroshima, Japan, and also in Tehran, Iran.
Okay.
And we put these up on the web.
Okay.
So that's pretty powerful. This particular picture, and I'll hold it so that the camera can see it well, was taken on November 11th of 2011.
Okay.
And it was a ceremony marking the beginning of something called Compassionate Louisville. We have a commitment to being a compassionate city. There's a movement of these cities around the world. And for the last 3 years in a row, our city has been named the model compassionate city
Wow.
for the entire planet. And so I was present when the mayor made a proclamation about this, and that was really pretty amazing.
We've asked every guest, older or younger, because of your leadership position, when the great day comes, God forbid it ends today, how do you want to be remembered, Terry?
I guess if there was one thing I would like to be remembered for, it's that I've helped some people who were maybe in conflict actually become friends. And when you can see people not only just tolerate each other, but learn that they have things in common and maybe work together and turn their attention to solving a problem. And there have been a few instances where I think I've been successful in that. And if I meet my maker and have to say something like, what would you like to be remembered for, it would be that.
That's great. Terry, it's quite a pleasure to have you on
It's
Leadership
my
Landscape TV.
And thank you for what you do for our community. This
Well,
is a
thank
great
you. I
service.
appreciate it. It means a lot to me for someone like you to say that. It's a very unique thing you've done with your life and what you've given your life too. So enjoy your retirement when it comes.
Thank you.
All right. If you have any general feedback or a guest suggestion, feel free to email me at kurt@leadershiplandscapetv.com. We're also on Facebook. Just type in Leadership Landscape. Till next time, I'm Kurt Jacobs. Thanks for watching.